The cinematic philosopher Ferris Bueller once said that life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you might miss it. The ever-growing collection of writings on this page are from my life. Moments spread out over a quarter of a century when I've stopped and looked around once in a while and wrote it down. Not years later and filtered through rose or gray-colored glasses. It's what I saw in that moment. It's what I didn't miss. Time and again. My father turned 90 last month, celebrating his birthday at our place with family all around. The weekend was thick and meaty, filled with decades-old stories, black and white photos, and the type of relaxed sharing that comes from that place of mutual memories and comfortable skin. The weekend was also marked by that peculiar malady of old age, best illustrated by the following. My father turned 90 last month, celebrating his birthday at our place with family all around. The weekend was thick and meaty, filled with decades-old stories. Yeah, you get the picture. My father repeats himself. He's joked for years that his forgetter is good, and truth be told, it's done nothing but get better with age. My younger brother drove down from Minnesota for the weekend, tossing a purple Vikings jersey to me as a gift as he entered. Like much of the weekend, this simple act reminded me of the past, of football games we watched together as kids, of quarterback Fran Tarkenton scrambling around the Vikings' backfield, juking and spinning away from would-be tacklers and waiting for a receiver to someday break free. His offensive lineman used to joke that if you missed your block the first time, no worries. Fran would be back in a minute and you'd get a second shot at it. It's the same with my father. Sit with him for a while, and if you miss a story the first time, no worries. He'll come back to it soon enough, and you'll get a second shot at it. I mean that with no disrespect. But sitting with my dad is like having a window seat into how our minds work, how one memory is wired to another, how one story begets another. I've become an expert in my father's life stories and how they are interconnected, even though many of them predate my own memories by decades. It's a dance we do together. He leads, I follow. But though overall the boundary lines have fallen for him in pleasant places, I also know that his 90-year-old dance floor is littered with the occasional landmine and slippery slope. I know which story will lead through an emotional reliving of conflict and temporary defeat, and which will lead through laughter and reflection. And after all these years, I know how to gently redirect the arc of a story to get us across that dance floor intact. But as I listened to my father tell and retell his life stories that weekend, and as I witnessed my children absorb them over and over as well, I began to realize that there's something almost profound about all of his repetition. The lesson too often eludes me in all of the repeated familiarity, but it's not lost on my kids. The thing about repeating yourself all the time is that it removes any mystery as to what's really important to you. It's not an act when all your stories end up in the same places, and simply put, the roads most traveled in my father's memory map end up in either one of two places. The first is his wife. I didn't expect to make 90, he told us over and over that weekend. And then he'd pause, a far-awake yearning in his eyes. But I sure wish my sweetie was here with me. But she got lymphoma, and that's a kind of cancer. And she died. Over and over, his stories would lead to my mom, some ending at the beginning with first dates and young love, and some beginning at the end with sadness and yearning. Maybe they all ended with a little sadness and yearning. I don't know. But they ended with his wife, my mom, his sweetie. And the second destination for my father's stories? Faith. If they don't end up with Mom, his stories end up with God. With his own imperfect attempts to follow God's will in his life, of God's faithfulness throughout. At Hope Church that Sunday, he pulled out his well-worn pocket-sized Bible and spun the pages to the lectionary reading for the day and held it out for me, his last-born son, to read along with. And I was struck by two things. First, my 90-year-old father's eyes are somehow markedly sharper than my own, as we could have been reading Harry Potter for all I could see. And second, that little Bible is as well-worn and traveled as his oft-repeated stories. It's safe to say that he knows more about that little book than I know about any single thing in my entire life. And it shows. At the end of that weekend, when my siblings were ready to hit the road, my father announced that he wanted to thank each of us for the special time we just spent together. He was thankful, he said, for his long life. He said he hadn't expected to make it to 90. and that he wished his sweetie was there with him. He said he was thankful to God for the years he'd been given, and he was thankful to us for sharing such a meaningful weekend. 2 minutes later, he said it again, phrased slightly differently, but the message was the same. 3 minutes after that, he cleared his throat and began anew. On the third thank you, I was a little embarrassed for him, and I stepped over to redirect him gently to another subject. But as I leaned in close to this good man, I realized that on his 90th birthday, my father's mind was full of love for his sweetie and thankfulness for his family and faith in his God. And it struck me that his life and all the repeated stories that reflect so much of his life hasn't been simple and hasn't been predictable. In the words of that little book he cherishes so much, he still remembers his affliction and his wandering, the bitterness and the gall. There have been times in his life, like in mine and perhaps in yours as well, when his soul has been downcast within him. And yet, standing where he stands now, he looks back, sometimes way back, and sees, far more often than not, God's provisions, God's faithfulness. And so my father said his thanks for a third time. After 9 decades of life, it was nothing new, but it was worth repeating and worth listening to, over and over and over again.